All right, folks, welcome to the February 9th, 2025 session of Macroeconomics Hours. We appreciate those of you joining us live. It's a good thing, and we obviously welcome the questions that you will get. Hadi and I will talk about tariffs this time, right? Sort of this seems to be a very salient topic. Hadi will start and talk more about the theoretical framework of tariffs, and I'll follow up with probably a much shorter discussion of some of the political economy considerations, the intersection between economics and politics that we see. Hadi, it's all yours.
Thank you. And hello to everyone again. What we decided to do this month, this meeting is to look at the tariffs and macroeconomy. There are about 8 reading materials that we have sent to you, and I list here. I'm going to be discussing these 4 items. Basically, the general message that one gets from the literature, how tariffs affect macroeconomic variables. And then the political economy is based on these 4 articles from The Economist, which is right now a lot of articles come out about how tariffs, what motivates the government to set tariffs and or retaliate, and what are the consequences, what are the motives. Now, what I'm going to be doing is that asking or trying to answer the questions like these. Will tariffs contribute to higher inflation? Will tariffs affect productivity and growth? What do we know how tariffs influence employment and wages? What's the implication for monetary policy, especially interest rates? And will tariffs reduce trade deficit? Because that's one of the claims that some people make, especially Trump seems to believe that U.S. has too much trade deficit with other countries, and it can be remedied by raising tariffs. So we're going to examine these questions. Now, very briefly, I wanted to review the market for importables to just remind you what tariffs might be doing and how they may be working. So let's suppose that we look at the product that the country is importing. Our country is importing, let's say, cars, or could be any other products, clothing, etc. And this is the domestic demand curve. Here's this domestic supply, and if there's no trade, point A will be equilibrium, price and quantity. But if one can buy this good from the rest of the world at price PW, and we assume that we can buy as much as we want at that price, this is the case, for example, for small countries that don't impact the world prices. So when they buy more, the price doesn't change that much. So if that's the case, then the economy is not going to be at point A. The economy actually is going to be importing some goods and producing some domestically. The quantity demanded will be QD, and point B represents the amount that domestic producers are willing to supply. And the difference between QD demanded and QS supplied domestically is imports. Now, if we impose a tariff on this economy, on this market, here I'm going to add tariffs to the price to the world price, so domestic producers and consumers will be facing a PW plus T, the amount of tax. And if that happens, then the quantity demanded will go down, quantity supplied domestically will be going up, and imports are going to be shrinking. So Q prime D minus Q prime S is going to be imports. In this case, the total amount that consumers pay for the imports is going to be this green rectangle, the amount of imports at the tariff times the price that people are paying, but they don't pay this entire amount to foreigners. Part of this is tariff revenue by the government, and the part that is paid to the foreigners is the green box. So in this case, you can see that if we impose tariffs, then domestic producers gain because they can produce more, they will be producing more and making more profit. Of course, as a result of that, consumers are going to be the losers here because they're going to be paying higher prices and buying less of the product. And foreigners also are going to be, they're not going to be affected that much. We're not going to be buying from them that as many units as we had before. But because the price is flat, there's not necessarily any cost to producers outside because they can presumably, if we don't buy their product, they can sell it to somebody else. Now, the initial amount of payment for imports is the 3 green boxes at the bottom, and after that, it's going to be reduced to the green box, initial green box that I've highlighted here. Okay, one last point with this graph. This is in fact the purpose of discussing this diagram. Wanted to highlight that, but what I said before was about an economy which doesn't have an impact on world markets. But if a large country like the US imposes a tariff, then it's possible that world price may go down. And this is, I think, something that Trump really counts on when he wants to negotiate trade deals with other countries. If the economy is large, once the tariff is imposed, then price goes up. By then price goes up, there's going to be a reduction in demand, and that affects the world markets, and that could push down the price in international markets. If that's the case, then let's say the initial price is PW, we impose the tariff, the world price goes down to P prime W, and in the domestic market, price that we will be paying is going to be P prime W plus T. Significance of this is that consumers don't quite pay all domestic economy. They don't pay all the tariffs because that was the case in the previous case where international price was not affected. Then consumers have to pay the tariffs to the government. Here, part of the tariff is paid by foreigners. So domestic consumers will be cutting down on the demand, goes to Q prime D. Domestic suppliers get a chance to produce more, Q prime S, and as a result, the imports shrink, and this green area is how much domestic consumers pay altogether for imports, and part of it goes to the government. Now, the part that goes to the government has two parts itself. this area at the top, this box is how much domestic consumers pay to the government, and this lower part is the amount of the tariff that is goes to the government, but who pays? That's foreigners who have to cut back on their price because of the pressure from reduced demand, which is the result of import tariffs. So that's what Trump seems to be counting on, that when he imposes tariffs, other countries start giving more discount and provide some of the money that is collected by the federal government in form of tariffs. Some of it comes from domestic consumers, and some of it comes from foreign producers who have to accept lower prices. This is the case if the country has market power, and it's likely the case for at least some products in the US. All right, with this background in mind, let me also have a general observation and then go answer those questions that I mentioned before. A general observation in the studies of impact of tariffs on macroeconomic variables is that the effects are there, but they tend to be very small. The reason is that essentially when you impose tariffs, firms and households decide to respond to that by switching their supply sources or the sales market where they sell their products, and the type of goods that they produce, the quality of products that they produce or consume, and that all those adjustments diminish the impact of the tariff on the economy. Let's now review the answers to the questions that I mentioned initially at the beginning
Okay,
of
sir.
our presentation.
Can I interrupt you for a second there?
Oh no, I'm listening to this microeconomics lecture.
Hey, can we go back to previous slide?
But no, she was just frustrated.
Go ahead. Yes. Question.
So the second bullet point, right? I think we have to go to the second bullet point. So in this case, in the case of US, switching, you said that the reason is that we can switch to a different supply sources, but in our case we may not have different supply sources. We mainly import from certain countries. So I'm not sure.
That's possible, but overall, when you look at the macroeconomic impact, because in many markets people can switch and substitute one for another. For example, let's say if you don't buy oil from Canada, this was part of the dispute and discussed. Then Canada is going to sell to some other buyer around the world, and the US needs the energy, needs to import oil. The US will be buying in the market. For example, let's say US buys more from Saudi Arabia, that creates an opportunity for Canada to go and sell to those who used to buy the Saudi Arabian oil. So all that adjustment takes place, and the overall impact on Canada and the US is not that large.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure. All right. Any other questions so far? All right. So do tariffs contribute to higher inflation? We just saw that in the diagram that I showed you before, that when you impose tariffs, the price goes up. And that is a very essential part of the effect of tariffs, because they raise the prices, so imports go down. If domestic consumers are not paying higher prices, then their demand will not go down, and the impact on imports is going to be very, very small, right? Or will not exist, and therefore, its impact is going to be on the quantity of imports is going to be minimal. But if they are effective, the tariffs are effective, raise the cost to the consumers domestically, and those consumers are going to be switching to buying other things, and those imports go down. So price ends up going above the price that exists in order to reduce imports for the country. Other prices, the importable prices go up. Other prices may go up or down. It depends on the situation of the industry and the type of product that you're talking about. Normally, very few prices decline because prices tend to be downward rigid. And overall, empirical studies show that tariffs cause domestic currency to appreciate. As a result, the demand for foreign currency, as a result of import tariffs, because we're importing less, we need less foreign currency, and therefore, in the currency market, the value of the domestic currency goes up relative to foreign currency, because foreign currency is experiencing reduced demand, and the domestic currency is going to be in higher demand because the importable sector is going to be producing more products, and demand shifts from foreign supply to domestic supply, and that increases the value of domestic currency. It's possible that this effect may lower the price of exportable goods, and that could create a mix of some prices going up, some prices going down. But overall, the studies that look at the impact of tariffs on inflation seem to conclude that the overall impact of the tariffs is to increase price level. This is not necessarily continued inflation, but for 1 or 2 years, we might see prices go up, and then inflation could continue at the level that it used to be before tariffs. Now, how do tariffs affect productivity and growth? Notice that tariffs essentially shift production towards activities that home economy is not good at, not very efficient. If an economy is producing a product very efficiently, then it tends to export it rather than import it. So when we restrict imports, producers come in who are not very productive, and on the other hand, in the area of exports, where we are producing goods that are producing efficiently, we're going to have less of that because the currency appreciates and discourages exports. And also, when you want to expand importables, you want to expand production of goods that used to be imported in the domestic economy, then you need to move resources from exportables to importables. So you're going to be cutting back in the activities in which we're very good, and adding to activities in which we're not that great. So that will reduce certainly productivity in the economy. So economy-wide productivity and output will decline as a result of tariffs. Now, this impact may maybe, for example, if the Trump administration goes ahead and imposes 25% of 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada and 10% on China, may have an impact in the range of about half a percentage to maybe up to 1% of GDP. That could be the cost, and that similar amount is going to be added to inflation. So, on top of this effect of shifting domestic resources from exportables to importables, there could be retaliatory tariffs that other countries are going to implement in order to punish the country that has reduced its demand for foreign goods. For example, Canada, immediately after the announcement by Trump of 25% tariff on Canada, held a press conference and announced that they're going to be putting 25% tariff on U.S. products being exported to Canada. So that retaliatory tariff affects exports of the country, and that reduces the high productivity parts of the economy, of the U.S. economy, and so that's going to be further reducing productivity in the country as well as economic growth. So in terms of production and productivity, the impact is negative. Similar results can be discussed about employment and wages. Tariffs shift in labor and employment from activities in home economy in which the economy has advantage towards the sectors that have less productivity and comparative advantage. Overall, employment and wages tend to decline, and again, retaliatory actions taken by other countries, by trading partners, is going to reduce employment and real wages in the home economy. For monetary policy, the impact is going to be actually, because inflation tends to rise, then that delays interest rate cuts, at least in current situation in the US. And that could also have negative impact on investment and on some sectors that are dependent on interest rate heavily. So, for example, housing market might actually experience a major slowdown because cost of production goes up as some goods that used to be imported at lower price, now we impose tariffs and the price rises domestically. So that may include a lot of inputs, ingredients that we need for building houses. So construction prices go up and price of houses go up, but the supply of housing is going to be reduced since the cost of production is going to be up. Employment could be cause the Fed to employment gets weaker, and because demand goes down for overall demand for labor goes down, and that could cause a dilemma for the Fed. The Fed wants to cut interest rates in order to stimulate the economy, but that could raise inflation further. So, if they keep the interest rate high, that employment is going to be hit. So the net effect is that the Fed is going to be in much more difficult bind to decide between whether it wants to continue higher interest rate policy or allow inflation to rise. The last question is, will tariffs reduce trade deficit? The answer to this is not really. Tariffs reduce imports, but they also affect exports negatively. As a result, trade deficit actually may not go down. What happens when we impose tariffs, we're shifting our labor and capital from exportables towards importables. And it causes also currency appreciation, which means that even though we have imposed tariffs, international the price of foreign goods goes up goes up for foreigners, and we won't be able to export that much because our currency is going to appreciate. And also foreign retaliation reduces our exports. So all of these affect our export market, revenues from our export market, and it's going to reduce. It's going to, right, it reduces our imports, but also affects our exports quite negatively. The net effect is actually not going to be much change in the trade deficit. And most importantly, and final point, trade deficit is actually determined by net savings in the economy, not by tariffs. If we have a budget deficit, somebody needs to save, and it helps the government to run a deficit. There's only so much domestic savings that we have. As a result, we need to borrow from the rest of the world, and in order to run budget, continue our budget deficit. So, as long as we have insufficient saving for the investment that we want to do, then we need to borrow from the rest of the world. We may impose tariffs on Mexico and reduce our imports from Mexico, but then we're going to be importing more from other countries, from some other place, in order to be able to borrow from them and maintain our budget deficit. So there could be a little bit of reduction in trade deficit, if the tariffs generate enough revenue to reduce the government budget deficit. But normally governments don't earn that much revenue from import tariffs. Even if we increase, say, average tariffs to 10%, at most we're going to get 1% of GDP in terms of revenue, and we're quite smaller than that. And as a result, it's not going to be much impact on the government's overall deficit, which then determines how much we need to borrow from the rest of the world. So the conclusion is that tariffs are not going to reduce trade deficits, and this is something that has been observed in previous occasions when tariffs went up, trade was reduced, but the deficit remained there. This kind of discussion has been going on since 1980s, and government has whenever government runs a budget deficit, it is normally associated with increases in trade deficit as a way of getting savings necessary to do the investment in the country. All right.
And so, Hadi, just a quick question. So net savings, when we talk about net savings in the economy, so this is basically, where the net savings come from is when we consume less than what our income is, right? And essentially part of the income is set aside for future consumption through investment, right? Investment by firms, savings by the household. and the government's not running the deficits. And this is our big challenge here in the trade deficit. It's not the politics of individual countries so much. It's our own behavior as a nation in terms of our consumption, correct? So that's the key challenge in here in explaining those trade deficits and in attempting to use tariffs to reduce those trade deficits.
Well said. I have some slides that, as a reminder, this might be helpful, that we go over why its deficit is determined by savings rather than by tariffs. And I'm going to just quickly show these slides. Just first, the definition. Our trade surplus is exports minus imports, which is, we call it net exports. And that's the negative of foreign savings. If we have trade deficit, it means that somebody is saving and giving us the money to run a trade deficit. If we have a net surplus, then it means that we are giving part of our savings to the rest of the world to enable them to buy our goods. So I assume you're familiar with this equation or identity, which Y is GDP, C is consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditure, and NX is net exports. Our GDP is determined by consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. So the two sides are always equal to each other. And if we move to the investment part, if you move to the consumption items, consumption and government expenditure to the left-hand side, then they become negative. So Y minus C minus G is our income minus government consumption and private consumption. So this becomes domestic savings. And the right hand is investment and net exports. Now, if we move the net exports to the left-hand side, we're going to have two parts. One is domestic savings, and minus net export is foreign savings. In the definition part that we have up there, and the investment is on the right-hand side. Now we can actually add the tax. Suppose total taxes are T. So we subtract T and we add T on the left-hand side in order to have separate out private savings from public savings. Y minus C minus T is private savings. T minus G is public savings, and minus NX is foreign savings. This relationship is what I meant when I said public savings. Public savings is government's budget surplus, but all the time, or most of the time, this public saving has been negative. Government is borrowing. So if we have a given amount of private savings and we want to run a budget deficit, then in order to be able to invest, we need to have positive foreign savings. It means that we need to have a negative net export. It means that we're going to have budget deficit. Sorry, trade deficit. So, but budget deficit causes trade deficit. With that, I'll stop and just answer any questions that you might have.
Folks, don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask any questions. Those of you who took macroeconomics for business as part of your IMBA program, you'll be familiar with this fundamental identity. You've seen it before. For some of you, that might be something new, but that's kind of our key explanation in macroeconomics as to, if we don't save domestically, then somebody else has to pay for our investment. and that somebody else is really the foreigners through trade deficits, right? All right.
All right. So your turn. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks very much, Hadi. Much appreciated. So, folks, let me talk, a little more about some of the political economy explanations of this issue, right? Because Hadi presented to us our traditional approach to tariffs and macroeconomics, and in general, economists are pretty. If there is one topic where we have a lot of agreement upon, right? And in macroeconomics, you will find that that's actually not terribly common, right? People have a variety of beliefs, variety of approaches. Economists overall tend to be pretty consistent about tariffs. We simply don't view tariffs as a good thing for us, right? So, in my own background, I come from, sort of my doctoral work was essentially work in public finance, right? Which is sort of the economics of the public sector, and the nice intersection between economics and political science. And so let me talk about some of those political economy explanations, and I'm primarily drawing them through the variety of articles from the economists that we gave to you during sort of an hour post on the group. All right. So let me talk very quickly about that. So reality check. And so this is an important check for us because we want to understand some of the largest sources of federal government's revenue. And so this data here comes from the United States Treasury. Keep in mind that in terms of the dollar amounts, this is a partial year's data because this is essentially our fiscal year 2025, which is from October 1, 2024 and up to now. So I believe it does include the January numbers, or potentially might be running through December. So this is a partial year. So the totals in dollars may not make very much sense, right? But as percentage, these are very representative of where our budget comes from, right? And so if you look at federal government's revenue, individual income taxes, and this is this very large circle right here, this account for roughly 48% of the budget. If you take into account what we call FICA taxes, roughly speaking, which is your Social Security and Medicare taxes, that comes up for another 36%. And you can see that if you sum up those two things together, you are already looking at, what is it, roughly 85% of government income that comes from those two sources, which is a huge chunk of income. Everything else is pretty much secondary, right? You add corporate income taxes to that, that's only another 10%. So over time, and after reforms of the first Trump administration, the corporate income taxes have gone down quite a bit. And so some of the push of the current administration is in driving the corporate income taxes down, continuing to drive that, right? If you look at excise taxes, and these are things like taxes on gasoline, that's only 2% of the federal government's income. And finally, when they come to those customs duties, which is where tariffs, this is tariffs, right? That, that is only 2% of the federal government's income. So the takeaway here is that tariffs account for a tiny, tiny portion of the federal government's revenue, right? And that's a very big challenge. If they're making a proposition here that somehow we're going to replace the individual income taxes by tariffs, right? You're comparing roughly 50% of revenue to roughly 2% of revenue. That's as the saying goes, that's a long road to hoe, right? That's the challenge here. And so if you look at the volume of imported goods in the United States, so we're talking about the potential tax base, what we call it in macroeconomics and in economics of the public sector. So tariffs, sort of our imported goods are roughly $3.1 trillion. If you look at the volume of individual incomes, that's roughly $20 trillion. And, it kind of depends on how you count that, right? Sort of you might look at all individual incomes. That includes public transfers, right? Essentially things like social security income and things like that. If you exclude the public transfers, I think the volume of individual income drops to roughly 15 trillion, maybe a tiny bit lower than that. But federal government essentially collects an effective tax rate that is roughly 11%, right? Sort of 11% is not necessarily, terribly high, right? It's obviously not distributed equally among people. Some people end up paying more than others. That's some of the, one of the fundamental characteristics of taxation, that taxation burden is not the same for everyone, right? And so, and the challenge in here is that the math here simply is not mathing terribly well, right? If you're trying to, sort of as the president has said, we'll eliminate individual income taxes, we'll pay for things through the tariffs, that's an extremely, extremely challenging proposition. And so even, sort of if you're just saying, okay, if we have a universal income of 10%, or universal, sorry, not income, but universal tariff of roughly 10%. If you're looking at 10% of 3.1 trillion, even assuming that this 3.1 trillion remains the same, we're only looking at 300 billion, right? So that's a lot less of what we're collecting as, 11% of roughly our 20 trillion in individual incomes, right? It's extreme. It would be extremely, extremely challenging, or most economists agrees that this is next to impossible, to essentially keep our expenditures the same and replace and switch our source of federal government's revenue from individual income taxes to tariffs, right? This is sort of this possibility is not there. And so, from that perspective, we might think and say, well, sort of could there be, something else that is going on right here? And so what might those explanations be? Sorry, okay, so all of a sudden, it starts working again. So political economy. So essentially, political economy is an intersection between economics and politics proper, political science proper. It's, if you want the definition, it's a study of how politics and the economy affect and shape each other, because it's a self-reinforcing relationship. And so one explanation, and this is something that Amol had put in the chat, is that we are playing perhaps some geopolitical games in here. As the experience of North Korea shows, sometimes being perceived as a madman of sorts can be helpful to you in pursuing your other objectives, right? If nobody doesn't quite know how you're going to react in tough situations, and you get the reputation of a tough guy, if you are playing the game of chicken with other countries, that could help you get ahead, right? And so that's a reasonable explanation, right? Sort of something that we can absolutely believe in. And if anything, so some of the recent statements and experiences with President announcing tariffs on Mexico, announcing tariffs on Canada, and then at the last minute putting a stop onto those tariffs, or at least giving those countries a temporary reprieve in exchange for their other actions, that can support that. But here is a big challenge with geopolitical games and the game of chicken used as a basis of policy, right? And that problem is uncertainty. So uncertainty is a problem because uncertainty generally kills investment. One of the Economist articles that we've shared with you gives a very good example of a typical firm's thinking about this. Let's say that the United States imposes significant tariffs on China, right? That could serve for you as, hey, China's future is really uncertain, right? We might decide to go to Mexico. Okay, then we announce tariffs on Mexico. And so all of a sudden businesses start thinking, well, sort of this looks to be a terribly uncertain kind of thing. My discounting rate on those projects all of a sudden goes up through the roof, right? the investment doesn't look like under uncertainty it's actually worth it. So we are not going to invest in Mexico. Well, let's say that we decide to invest in Canada. And so the same thing happens in Canada. And all of a sudden you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And you're, for a typical firm, the reasonable way to address this is to just kind of sit on a side for a little bit until the water calms down, right? And so it's reasonable from a firm's perspective, but what it does on a macroeconomic level, if most firms start acting in this way in responding to the uncertainty by doing nothing, that kind of kills the investment component of the GDP, right? Because firms are simply not investing into future production of goods and services, right? And so that's a very big challenge that can, lead to the lower growth rate of GDP, that can lead to recessions. This is something that we generally want to avoid.
Professor, if
Go
I
ahead.
may.
Yes.
So the example you gave us, right? So the firms may not, the US firms may not invest in China, Mexico, or Canada, but they may invest in US, right?
Mm-hmm.
So don't you think that will have a good effect?
Yeah, well, that is the hope of this, right? Because this is essentially this uncertainty about foreign investment means perhaps a little bit more certainty about domestic investment. But for many firms, that domestic investment might not be a terribly good situation either, right? Especially if the domestic sector of the economy is not terribly competitive. But that's indeed one of the reasons for playing this game, right? Essentially, we're trying to force the firms to bring back their production into the United States. That could be one of the goals, right? So that's a very good point. But let me go back to the second part of uncertainty, and that part of uncertainty comes from consumers' expectations. So generally speaking, in macroeconomics, one of the big challenges compared to microeconomics is that expectations matter quite a bit, and expectations very often become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you look at some of the major measurements of United States consumer sentiment, for example, it's a consumer sentiment index that the University of Michigan is running. Basically, if you look at its measurement from February surveys, those measurements don't look terribly good. On average, consumers are less enthusiastic about the economy going forward, right? Sort of that sentiment dropped by something like 4 percentage points, which was very significant. And consumers also have revised their short-term inflationary expectation. So in just a month, previously consumers were saying that in roughly a year, they expect inflation to be around 3.3%. Right now, as of the February measurement, they're saying that they think that inflationary expectation are going to be something like 4.3% going forward. And both of those things represent challenges. Because if you think that the economy is going to perform worse in the future, how would you respond to that as an individual consumer? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. What's going to be your typical reaction?
Pull back on spending?
That's right. So you're going to try to spend a little less, right? You're going to try to save a little more. This is going to be your rainy day fund, right? And if you're starting to spend a little less, or maybe a lot less for some of the consumers who are employed in, potentially in U.S. government, right? If you're talking about consumers who are, employed in other fields that are very sensitive to imports and exports, they could be cutting down their spending quite a bit. And so that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're feeling worse about the future. You're starting to spend less now. And as you start to spend less now, that actually impacts the future, and it pushes it exactly in the direction of your sentiment, right? If you're thinking that inflationary expectations, inflation is going to be higher 1 year from now, you might be making some of the decisions to potentially, accelerate, you could make actually decisions to accelerate some of your purchases, right? But in the short run, that also has the potential to increase inflation. If all of a sudden in the short run, it's relatively hard to expand your production quickly by firms in the short run. But in the short run, we have more money chasing the same amounts of goods and services. What we're going to see is prices increasing right now, which further reinforces those inflationary expectations and creates kind of this vicious spiral, right? So those sorts of things, uncertainty is bad for business. And by being bad for and by impacting the consumer decisions in a certain way, it becomes pretty bad for the economy pretty quickly. So you can only play geopolitical games and increase uncertainty for so long until it starts reflecting itself in the macroeconomic performance, right? All right, so any questions about this so far, folks?
Professor, would there be any correlation with the dollar rate in the international market by increasing the tariffs?
Well, sort of as Hadi talked about, if you're looking at, sort of at what happens to the exchange rate, right? So that's what you're asking about. Generally speaking, something like that basically means appreciation of the US dollar, right? So, and that appreciation also comes from another source. If you are engaged in geopolitical games that increase uncertainty not only in the United States, but worldwide, then all over the world, there is going to be a bit of a flight to safety, right? And so, what kinds of financial instruments and what kinds of financial currencies are considered to be pretty safe ones? Well, one of them is gold potentially, right? So, we can expect that the price of gold could go up. So, but that's not terribly relevant. But because United States dollar is still treated as a reserve currency of sorts, that also means that the U.S. dollar is expected to appreciate to help the dollar appreciate more. And yes, this is a typo. That should have been a madman, not madman. I'm sorry about that, Vivian. I have to do better checking of my grammar, I guess. Thank you. Okay, so we know that sort of this is very consistent with what we sort of we expect will happen to the currency as a result of tariffs, right? Okay, and so if
Professor,
go ahead.
so since we're talking about politics, right? And if under political influence, Fed drops the rates in the current situation, how it's going to affect the economy overall?
Yeah, Fed is typically considered to be fairly isolated from political pressure. Whether, if this is still the case, I don't really quite know, because the independence of a number of government agencies had been questioned, and it's possible that in the future Fed will experience a lot more pressure. But generally speaking, if you lower the interest rates prematurely, so that can potentially lead to more inflation, right? So think about this. If the optimal policy right now in response to still relatively high inflation is continuing with the contractionary interest rate policy, if you switch to suboptimal policy, what that will lead to is continued higher inflation, right? So that's a pretty big challenge. All right. Well, let me switch to potentially talking about some different targets. So another explanation in here that comes from political economy is that maybe this is a different sort of game, right? Maybe what is really being pushed through is the impact is essentially emphasis on immigration policy rather than tariffs, and we are simply using tariffs as leverage to get other countries to do our bidding. And there is some good evidence from that, right? Because how did Mexico win that temporary regime from tariffs? Well, it's by agreeing to, number one, beef up the border security on their side, and number two, by agreeing to essentially take immigrants from other countries back to Mexico when sort of they attempt to cross the border, right? And so Canada has already beefed up its border security as well, and it made additional promises, even though this were probably relatively small promises when everything is said and done. But maybe it's the border security that is the true leverage, and tariffs here are only a threat but nothing that the Trump administration actually intends to follow through. So that is a potential explanation. Another explanation, of course, is that what the administration is trying to achieve here is reindustrialization and reduction of trade deficits. Even though you could probably achieve some reindustrialization by bringing some manufacturers to the United States, reducing trade deficits through tariffs is very tough, right? Because it still depends on other things a lot more. It depends a lot more on what our domestic savings are. And if our domestic savings are pretty low, then you can continue increasing those tariffs, but they're not going to make a huge difference in terms of the trade deficits, right? But the hope is that if you're basically trying to lower the tax burden overall, if you're trying to introduce a regulatory regime, if you're using those tariffs as another kind of negative incentive, because those two are positive incentives, but the negative incentive of tariffs is also there. Maybe that's how we drive manufacturers back to the United States. But as Hadi mentioned in his presentation, that has all kinds of macroeconomic consequences too, right? Personally, I'm fairly skeptical about government forcing the economy through industrial policies to behave in certain ways, right? People will say that, hey, it worked really well through China, sort of by pursuing the industrial policies that led to the Chinese resurgence and becoming essentially the suppliers to the world. How well it could work for the United States, I think, is up for significant discussion. And so that remains to be seen. And, sort of maybe, and I think, to me, this part is perhaps a bit of a better explanation. Maybe the approach in here is that despite the rhetoric that says, oh, we are going to get rid of personal income tax and replace it by tariffs, just like we had it, before 1930s, right? But it's not terribly reasonable. But what the Trump administration might be attempting to get done and might be attempting to get its opponents on the other side of the political aisle to essentially accept is essentially continuing the tax cuts that were made under the previous Trump administration, because there have been some personal income tax cuts, right? There have been significant corporate income tax cuts. The federal government is limited, or the Congress is limited by its own rules from passing laws that impact your ability to cut revenue beyond 10 years, right? And maybe that's simply an argument to get the Democratic Party to accept, hey, don't play with tariffs too much, but at least, or sort of maybe have a relatively low universal tariff that is not going to impact us terribly, but those relatively low universal tariffs may actually pay for some of those previous tax cuts, right? And they may justify continuing to regulation. So maybe that's a part of the game. And to me, this might be at least a tiny bit of a better explanation of what is going on, right? Okay. Sort of what basically confirms me in my thinking is that if you consider kind of like the volume of tax that you can raise at the 10% universal tariff, that basically will roughly pay for the retaining prior tax cuts back from 2018, right? So that could be the way to do it, right? Okay. All right. And one question that I want to ask here is that what kind of signals might actually drive or determine further action by the Trump administration? Well, it does seem like the stock market performance probably is going to be something that will matter. And if the stock markets respond very strongly, that may give a push to the administration to potentially delay or moderate their tariff plans. And this is consistent with what we've seen. Once Trump announced the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, what we've seen in here is a pretty significant stock market drop. I think S&P dropped by about 3%, which was pretty significant. So many of us have experienced those drops in our retirement savings and 401k accounts, right? Once the tariffs postponed, the stock market actually recovered quite a bit of their losses, right? what we also have might have in here is that other signals might come from performance of other markets. And one analogy that I can draw in here is potentially pricing of government debt, right? Those of us who remember the United Kingdom's experience with Liz Truss, who was one of the prime ministers, or at least in the recent history, who had the shortest term of what was it, roughly 45 days, right? If I recall correctly. But she was a very short-lived prime minister, right? And so how did your prime ministership get derailed? Well, the government did an unfunded tax cut of roughly 45 billion pounds, right? Which was extremely significant. This tax cut proposal did not go through any of the regular channels, such as having statistical analysis done of what the impact on the economy might be. And all of a sudden, asset markets reacted very quickly to this, right? The debt premium or the risk premium on UK government debt went through the roof, right? It pushed the government into first insisting that no, those tax cuts are going to be here to stay, and then the very same day saying, oh no, those tax cuts are going to go, right? So this incredible uncertainty basically destroyed Liz Truss's government, right, and led to a change in government eventually. We certainly don't want to see the Treasury debt premiums go up. Because if the Treasury debt premiums go up, given the volume of the debt that the United States government issued, the impact on our budgets could be extremely, extremely significant. And with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen. I think that's all that I wanted to talk about for now. And I will be happy to take your questions.
Hey, Professor, a quick question on the previous slide. I think I was talking on mute before. I believe you can open that slide on the tariff thing. So one of the explanations that this Trump was giving, and that I heard on the news, obviously I don't have facts, is kind of because we are having deficit is because the tax that is being levied on our exports is pretty much high in the other countries. Like for example, he talked about some VAT and other things that exist in other countries that are being higher. So essentially, they are not helping our industries to have benefits in their countries, right? I think that's some kind of a negotiation that they're trying to achieve. Could you kind of talk about that as a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, so that certainly could be a potential target of the political economy, right? If you're basically viewing that as one of the tools to reduce the import tax burden levied on the United States by other countries, that could be a possibility. Unfortunately, generally speaking, and as our experience had shown, when you start playing that game of chicken with other countries, unless you are being viewed as extremely credible in what you're pursuing, other countries will simply respond with other tariffs, right? So once you impose tariffs on Canada, right, what the Canada would do is that it will impose reciprocal tariffs on the imports from the United States, right? And so in the very end, everyone becomes worse off as opposed to you getting a significant benefit from something like that, right? So could be one of the goals. How well something like that could work is not really clear. Given the United States, sort of membership in a variety of tax pacts, right, in a variety of international tariffs pacts, the World Trade Organization, and so on and so forth. I mean, generally speaking, the burden of tariffs on United States firms' exports generally tends to be low, right? There is probably criticism that could be made about policies employed by other countries against certain sectors or certain parts of imports. I think that's generally speaking fair game. But again, I'm skeptical about how well this could actually work.
Alrighty. Thank you so much.
All right. All right, folks, any other questions or any other thoughts that you wanted to share? So I'm curious. Go ahead, Nadine.
So I think, Professor, this administration will probably only react to what market says or what the consumer prices dictates or other all other indicators. Probably, I'm not sure if they will react to that. And the reason for that, I think, is because the Dodge is taking over a lot of government agencies. So the data coming from that agencies, I don't know how accurate or how reliable that's going to be. I'm talking about the first bubble graph you put
Uh,
in the slide. So I
yeah.
think the market will probably dictate how this government is going to make the decisions, I think.
I think you're probably right about that, right? And let me just talk very quickly about another potential concern here. I know that we're a little, we're at 2:07 p.m., so we've been here on this phone call a little longer, and so I do appreciate your time, folks. Much appreciated. But here's another thought that I have on this. So what the Department of Government Efficiency appears to be working on is essentially reducing the government expenditure, right? And so we've heard a lot of things so far because, sort of typically what Republican administration tends to cut are things that are not defense, right? But in this administration, we're hearing already some discussion, some rhetoric about reducing spending, reducing wasteful spending everywhere in the federal government, including defense, right? And so that leads me to think that perhaps if you want another political economy explanation, is maybe the idea here um, is essentially what is often called in public finance starving the Leviathan or starving the beast, right? So Leviathan is kind of like this mythical, biblical, dragon of sorts, right? That can, swallow the world essentially, right? And many public finance scholars have talked about ever-growing governments as a Leviathan that has to be restrained in order to avoid destroying the economy in the very end. And so maybe the idea here is that if you starve the government, starve this Leviathan by constraining its income sources, right? By reducing various income taxes, by implementing tariffs that will not raise a lot of the tax for you, that gives you justification to cut down spending, right? And philosophically, that could be a significant explanation that basically means that all of that discussion for tariffs and all of the actions taken here are basically the goal for reducing the size of the government, for significantly limiting its effectiveness, right? Sort of going from there, right? That could absolutely be an explanation. So the target here is much more federal government spending rather than the federal government revenue. Or rather, revenue is being cut in order to starve the government from its ability to spend money. Does this make sense? Does this address your question, Nadim?
Yeah, actually, it was not a question, more of a comment,
Yeah.
because market data, the stock data is available without any distortion. The
Mhm.
data, I think, in the future coming from these government agencies, because I think may be distorted, or I don't know, people may not have faith in that because of their political beliefs, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think the market will probably dictate, I think,
Mhm.
how the government is
No,
going to.
I agree here. I think, sort of the Trump administration is fairly responsive to market signals, right? And so one of the reasons why it feels fairly emboldened, many of the actions that it's taking, is that the markets have not reacted terribly strongly, other than the 3% drop to the tariff announcement, right? And then again, as a 1 month reprieve was announced for both Canada and Mexico, sort of the markets basically recovered most of what they've lost, and they still, sort of remain at fairly historically high prices, right? So, I agree. So what sort of those changes in so those changes in the asset values for the stock market, right, are going to be a significant driver or significant signal for future policy actions, and also the pricing of U.S. Treasuries. Because if the United States experiences anything like what the United Kingdom has experienced in their attempt to drive down the revenues and cut them down very significantly, I think the reaction could be just as swift as it was in the United Kingdom, right? And a lot of those proposals could be reversed very quickly.
Thank you, Professor.
All right, thanks, Nadim. All right, folks, maybe one small question if anybody else wants to ask it, but since we're already a little behind our schedule, we'll say goodbye to each other after that, and we'd love to also get some of your ideas for future sessions too. So any other questions or suggestions?
Let me just ask a question and also maybe a point. Markets don't seem to really take Trump seriously in terms of going ahead, further ahead with the tariffs. Am I reading it right? Investors in the stock market don't seem to believe that Trump is serious. And if that's the case, then I would be surprised if, let's say, European Union takes Trump's threats seriously.
What do you think, folks?
It could be also that markets think that the retaliation threat and the fact that markets may go down later on are enough signal for the administration not to proceed with policies that are damaging, and therefore investors should be comfortable, should not worry about it, because he's not going to go ahead with his damaging policies.
I don't think so, Professor. I think market will react at least in the short run. That's my opinion.
But I think, sort of so far, markets haven't reacted very strongly, right? At least this is what my sense seems to be as well. Would you agree with that, Nadim?
Yeah, but again, it's only a short, it's almost like less than a month since they've, taken over the presidency. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, well, so far the markets are saying, well, we kind of believe that this is just for the show right now, right? Sort of this is the, political entertainment that we are experiencing. And, but, if that continues, sort of how long will the markets think that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor.
Time to say goodbye.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Talk to you
Thank you.
soon. If you see anything fun or interesting, post it on our LinkedIn group site, and we'll post this recording to our YouTube channel as well. Thanks all. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.